welcome to the Migration Summit 2023. It's quite an emotional session. This is our last hosted panel before the closing ceremony on the 2nd of May. So we're really excited to have you here today for our last session, and thank you for the panel to be here today. My name is Lorraine Charles. I'm the Executive Director of NAML and one of the co-chairs of the Migration Summit. The Migration Summit 2023 is organized by MIT React, Namal Karam Foundation, and it's a month-long global convening designed to build bridges between diverse communities of displaced learners, universities, companies, social enterprises, policymakers, employers, and governments around key challenges and opportunities for refugee and migrant communities. This year, we've examined the theme co-creating pathways for learning, livelihoods, and dignity. And I think this is a great session to end, looking at how we can build a refugee-led research agenda. Because the Migration Summit is all about how can we center programs and discussion and narratives around refugees. And I'm really happy to have UNHCR, Alana, hosting you. So welcome, Alana, and welcome, colleagues. I'm really excited to have you here today.
Thanks so much, Lorraine, and a pleasure to be here with you all as well as alongside some very wonderful panelists and speakers that we're really excited for you to hear from today. As Lorraine mentioned, my name is Alana, and I work on UNHCR's higher education team based out of Copenhagen. And as I'm sure you're all aware, today's session is really focused on building a refugee-led research agenda, what that really means, what some of the priorities and key considerations might look like, as well as some presentations on what some of the exciting research initiatives happening in this space are today. So before I kick things off, just a little teaser of some of the panelists and speakers that you'll be hearing from up on the screen today. They'll be speaking about the work their organizations do, their own experience as researchers, and how they view the future of research in forced displacement and migration studies. But I'll allow them to introduce themselves when they speak. And just for a quick look at the agenda to come for this session, first, there'll be presentations from each of these organizations, and then we'll have a panel discussion around some of the considerations of ethics, positionality, and accountability in refugee-led, refugee participatory research. So with that, thank you all again for joining. And I will first invite Katrina from Jigsaw to introduce herself and her colleagues and to speak to us about her work.
Thanks, Alana. Hey, everyone. Lovely to be here today. My name is Katrina, as Alana said, and I am a researcher at Jigsaw, which is a UK-based research organisation that exists to build rigorous evidence for lasting change in education, specifically in low-income contexts. Today, as you can see, I'm here with two of my colleagues, Aime Parfait, Emerusenge, and Aime Mkankusi. I don't know if you guys want to just say a quick hello and say where you're based and what your roles are at Jigsaw. Maybe Aime Parfait, would you like to start?
Yes, sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Aime Parfait Emerusenge, and I'm based in Kigali, but I'm a refugee, originally from Burundi, and I'm a research assistant at Jigsaw. Thank you.
Hi everyone, it's nice to be here. My name is Aime Mkankusi, as Katrina said. I'm based in Kigali, in Rwanda, but I'm a Congolese refugee based in Kiziba refugee camp in the western province of Rwanda. Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Wonderful. So all three of us will be participating in the panel in a few minutes, well, in about half an hour. But before that, I'm going to give you an overview of some of Jigsaw's recent work with refugee education research, focusing in on a particular project called the Voices of Refugee Youth Project, which has just come to the end of its 3-year lifespan. My aim today is really to share with you some of the key learnings from this project for ensuring equity within refugee education research with a specific focus on participatory approaches, and to consider how these learnings may be used in the service of building an increasingly refugee-led research agenda. Next slide, please. So just a really quick intro to the project that I mentioned, Voices of Refugee Youth. This was funded by Dubai Cares and had 3 core partners. The first was ourselves, Jigsaw, and also Refugee Education UK and UNHCR. It was also supported by Centrality and John Carroll University in the United States, who supported with the associated training program. Next slide, please. Great. So Voices was created to address 4 current key issues. Firstly, the significant evidence gaps within refugee education. Secondly, the marginalisation of refugees from research and evidence building. Thirdly, the lack of refugee youth access to higher education. And finally, the lack of employment pathways for refugee youth. So next slide, please. Thank you. So the primary research objective overall was therefore to build the evidence base for post-primary education for refugee youth through a refugee youth-centred methodological approach. So to achieve this, a group of youth researchers was recruited in each of the focus countries. The 2 focus countries you can see there were Pakistan and Rwanda, which were established in conversation with the UNHCR. These youth researchers, 30 overall, 31, 15 and 16 in each respective country, were trained by Jigsaw and Refugee Education UK as collaborators in the research process. So youth researchers participated in different aspects of the research, different activities to different extents. Key activities included co-design of tools, data collection, analysis, presentation of findings. So their participation in training also resulted in them gaining a graduate level qualification in applied research, which was accredited by John Carroll University. Next slide, please. Thank you. So by adopting this approach, Voices of Refugee Youth has, firstly, it's helped to build evidence for refugee education, thereby providing rigorous outputs to shape policy and practice. Secondly, it's provided opportunities for accredited graduate level study for refugees through building and delivering a blended learning diploma that I just mentioned in applied research. Thirdly, it has increased pathways to employment for refugees, which will enable youth researchers to gain future work in research. And finally, it has positioned refugees at the centre of the research process, enabling the sector to engage more with refugees when making evidence-informed decisions. I want to stress at this point the real importance that we place on refugee education research specifically, particularly for driving forward a refugee-led research agenda. One of the core systemic barriers we know to refugee-led research is arguably the enduring lack of opportunity for refugees to have access to high-quality education at all levels, and lack of access in particular to the advanced degrees needed to participate in research and research leadership. So this is part of why building evidence on and advocating for refugee education in particular, we feel is so important for refugee-led research to be feasible. Next slide, please. So a very quick summary of the study itself. It was a longitudinal panel study consisting of 3 data points. Over a 2-year period, we tracked a cohort of refugee youth through their experiences of and transitions from post-primary education. At each data point, we conducted surveys to gather a range of data, including refugees' personal backgrounds, learning experiences during secondary and higher education, their experience of learning during COVID-19, and their perspectives on their situations post-graduation, including challenges faced and their future plans. And we also collected qualitative data to complement and expand on the survey data. Next slide, please. So excitingly, off the back of the Voices of Refugee Youth, we are now in the process of developing GEAR, Global Evidence for Refugee Education. This is a new applied research initiative with young refugee researchers at the centre, which exists to build better evidence and improve decision-making for refugee education. It builds on the high-impact prototype of Voices of Refugee Youth and is a 5-year commitment to really shift the sector. It aims to build evidence in at least 6 countries with more than 150 young refugee researchers. There's also an aim to establish a global diploma in applied research tailored to refugee researchers, and the ultimate aim is to establish a global cohort of high-caliber refugee researchers to shape the future of refugee education research themselves. Next slide, please. So thinking about these experiences that we've been having recently in refugee education research, what ethical considerations need to be made during displacement-based research, such as voices of refugee youth and GEAR. In this, Jigsaw is really guided by standard ethical research principles, while acknowledging that particular attention needs to be paid to some aspects. So some of these you can see in front of you now. Obtaining informed consent and conducting thorough risk assessments are obvious elements. But when working with displaced communities, I think it's more important than ever to ask the hard, fundamental questions. Why are we really doing this? Who stands to benefit from this research? If the displaced community does not stand to benefit from the research, then it really should not be being conducted. It's also crucial to consider research team positionality, and I know we'll probably talk about this a lot more in the panel, but I'll talk about it briefly now from the Jigsaw perspective. In cases where research involves refugee researchers, as in Voices of Refugee Youth, we have spent considerable time discussing refugee researchers' positionality as both researchers and community members and the benefits and challenges of this position. But beyond that, on an organisational level, one of the key issues for us as Jigsaw, a global North non-refugee-led organisation, is how do we navigate our positionality in this context? There arguably have to be organisations like ours who lead change and push forward the refugee-led research agenda in the current context. But we exist in a difficult and at times contradictory space within this debate. How can we work to support the establishment of a refugee-led research agenda as advocates and allies when we also work within and benefit from existing structures that are often inherently exclusionary to refugees and global South researchers? We're trying to use our position to work effectively as allies, but are arguably often implicitly perpetuating these unjust systems, risking falling into paternalistic behaviours, and so on. There therefore really needs to be a continuous process of self-reflection from organisations like ourselves of our role in this context, and an acknowledgement of the fact that the ultimate aim may or should be to work ourselves out of existence eventually, or at least to radically resituate ourselves within the refugee research landscape in order to achieve a truly refugee-led research agenda. But I won't go into details here, as I know that time is short. Other crucial ethical aspects for us to include sharing findings with participating communities, really important, to ensure that they are able to benefit from the new knowledge that has been generated by the research. Really important also to avoid generalization to refugee groups, which are deeply heterogeneous. And yeah, we should be really, really careful of that. And finally, adopting participatory approaches, the ethical setup of which is something that I'd like to spend the last couple of minutes of my 10 minutes discussing. So final slide, please. Thank you. So specific ethical considerations for participatory approaches involving refugee researchers for us include, firstly, recruiting through a rigorous, transparent process. Secondly, offering fair payment in consultation with refugee researchers to determine what is going to be fair in each context. Providing training to enable refugee participation. Now, this for me is perhaps the most crucial element of both participatory and refugee-led research, both of which are not possible unless refugees have the skills, knowledge, and confidence to participate in or lead research activities. Offering different participation levels is really important as well, and this should be done according to both ability and interest of the refugees involved. If anyone's interested in exploring this more, we have used Hart's Ladder of Participation, which is a helpful model that's been adapted over the years. Also considering refugee research-specific positionality, which I covered briefly earlier. And finally, acknowledging that accountability should primarily be towards refugee researchers, research participants, and their communities. I think that's it from me, actually. Just final slide. Just to say, thank you so much, and I hope this has given us a really good idea, that's given you a good idea of some of Jigsaw's work in this space over the last few years, and has provided some food for thought that hopefully we can expand on in the panel. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Katrina. I think that was a really wonderful overview, both of the Voices of Refugee Youth project, but also thinking a little bit about some of those hard questions you brought up when it comes to being both advocates and allies, but also working within existing research systems, how to build truly participatory systems at the same time. And I think it'll be really good food for thought, as you said, in the upcoming discussion. So with that, I will pass it over to the Refugee-Led Research Hub, to Fonny and Bisimwa. Thanks so much.
Yes, thank you so much, Alana. First of all, I would like to say that I'm really excited and I'm honored to be here today to be part of the panel. My name is Bisimwa Mlemangabo. I work with the Refugee-Led Research Hub as a lead researcher. My role at the Hub is to support the research processes of the Hub from proposal development, implementation of research projects, to dissemination of findings. So I'll be presenting with my colleague, Fonny Joyce. Fonny, please introduce yourself, and then we can go to the presentation.
Thank you very much, Bisimwa. Hello, everyone. My name is Fonny Joyce Buni. Originally from South Sudan, but based in Nairobi, Kenya. Within the research hub, I am a lead researcher. I get to work with Bisimwa and other colleagues, really focusing on supporting other colleagues in research, as well as just leading research from the start to the end. We'll get to interact a bit more later. Over to you, Bisimwa.
Thank you, Fonny. Now we can go to the next slide. Yes, so what is the Refugee-Led Research Hub? We are an initiative of the Refugee Studies Center at the University of Oxford. And our main mission really is to support individuals with lived experience to lead research in the field of forced displacement studies. And we create opportunities for scholars and researchers with displacement background to lead primary and secondary research in the field of refugees and forced displacement. So we are really working towards shifting power and making sure that refugees and forced displaced scholars are included into knowledge production. Our main office is based at the University of Oxford Refugee Studies Center. We also have an office in Nairobi at the British Institute in Eastern Africa. Next slide. Okay, thank you. Yeah, so this is a snapshot of our theory of change. Looking at this, really, we see that we have a number of programs. And this is at the activity level. Then we have a number of outputs that we are trying to achieve. Then we have the outcomes and impact. At the activity level, we have the research program, and then we also have the academic program and professional training. Under the research program, what we do is training for training refugee scholars and researchers on research methodologies. We also conduct independent studies and studies in collaboration with partners. Then we work with partners to disseminate our research findings through different events. Under the academic program, we have a project called Pathways. This project enrolls learners on a 3-month course to acquire introductory knowledge in the field of refugees and forced migration, and also to prepare them for postgraduate studies. We also support our learners through application process to access higher education after the Pathways program. So under the professional training and development program, here we work with a wide range of partners, both in Eastern Africa region, but also in Africa and beyond, to create opportunities, professional opportunities for our affiliates. So as you can see on this theory of change, the overall really goal is to have people with lived experience of displacement lead system changes in knowledge production and responses to displacement. Now, let's look at some of our research projects so far. So far, we've conducted a number of research projects in collaboration with partners. One of the projects is the refugee-led organizations in Eastern Africa. This project looked at the perception of communities on the impact of refugee-led organizations in 4 countries in East Africa. So the study was conducted in Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, and Ethiopia, and it was led by refugees and other persons with lived experience themselves. The other study is on the study looking at finding durable solutions, refugees' access to citizenship and permanent residency in Kenya. This was looking at the gap between policy and practice of access to citizenship and permanent residency for refugees in Kenya. So this was led by myself with the support from a colleague from the University of Nairobi. Then we also have a study on access to work permits and business licenses in Kenya. And this again was looking at the gap between policy and practice of refugees' access to work permits and business licenses. My colleague, Foni, led this research, and we are now in the final stages of disseminating the findings. Yeah, so as you can see, we have also conducted also a number of other small consultancy projects. For example, with the Refugee Self-Reliance Initiative and other organizations within Kenya projects. And I'll now the next slides. Over to you, Foni.
Thank you very much, Bisimwa, for sharing our work. Within the hub, we use refugee researchers really to refer to any researcher who has personally been affected by displacement, including former resettled returnees, asylum seekers, IDPs, stateless, and other groups that have been forcibly displaced or live in exile. So throughout the presentations that Bisimwa and I will be making today, you'll keep on hearing us referring to refugee researchers. I think it's clear that despite some of the progress that has been made when it comes to refugee-led research, there's still quite a lot of obstacles that refugee researchers face. The first one being that when it comes to refugee-led research, engagement of the researchers usually tends to be superficial. They're not really involved in the decision-making process that deal with the research process. And I think what we're trying to do with the hub is really look at how can we get to that stage where we actually walk the talk and how do we involve refugees from the start to the end. There are also instances where refugees are engaged in ad hoc basis, where they're involved in the decision-making processes that they're not really involved in the decision-making processes that deal with the research process. Rather, you're brought on board based on the fact of we actually want representation. So this is still a challenge that is still going on when it comes to refugee-led research, which we'll be breaking down further when we get to the next discussion. We've also seen that researchers who've engaged when it comes to leading research from the start to the end, most of the time, their trajectory or pathways to becoming independent researchers is still a huge challenge, where they have gained the right expertise and experiences, but there's no clear pathway on how they can also become independent research within their own space. So this is still a challenge that multiple researchers who are still displaced still encounter these particular challenges as they engage within the research space. Next slide, please. Within the hub, one of the things that we're also trying to do, as we're really trying, as I mentioned, we're really trying to walk the talk that I'm just highlighting. And what this has meant is that we have to look at the team setup. How do we set up the team so that we actually we say what we do, what we say we're going to do. At the beginning, Bisimo mentioned that within the team, within the hub, majority of the leadership colleagues are with a displacement background, and they're supported by non-refugee colleagues. And with refugees at the center of the organizational leadership, this has also meant that they can explicitly contribute to all the different academic and research activities that we run within the hub. So what the hub has also tried to do is provide a space where refugee scholars or refugee researchers can really demonstrate their agency. They can really contribute to knowledge production, and they can use their experiences as well as their expertise within this space of forced migration. And this is really important so that they can really actively participate from the designing to the implementation of different research projects, not only as research participants or recipients, but really as the people who are driving this forward. And this is really important for us. So the team setup has been one of the things that we're very intentional about working on as a way of supporting refugee-led research. The second aspect of it has been decision-making. And I think all different organizations have to make decisions, but at the same time, how do we engage refugee researchers when it comes to the decision-making processes? So within the hub, what we've done is we've tried to really be keen, as well as develop clear decision-making pathways for the organization, as well as for the studies that we undertake in, really in order to address the different power imbalances that play out. So the core team is definitely led by refugee researchers who work with also the non-refugees to really come to key decisions. So really ensuring that there's that space for both refugee researchers and non-refugee researchers to really have conversations and come to a conclusion on what needs to be done. And this has also meant that we need to meet monthly to check in on progress that has been made as the key discussion points that we agree on, at the same time to also ensure accountability to the plans. So really having a clear division of responsibilities and the steps to take in order to come to an agreed decision has been a step that we've seen very important when we're looking at refugee-led research support. Next slide, please. As we're doing this, we've really tried to put, I'm just touching on some of the things that we've done, and during the discussion, we'll get further into it. But as we've been working on this, and also through my experience as a refugee researcher, lessons that we've learned, there are many lessons that we've learned, but I'll just talk about two today. The first one being navigating ethics. We all understand ethics as being very important and pertinent when we're conducting research. However, from my own experience, while collecting data, we do have the standard ethics that are provided, standard ethics that guide how research should be conducted, the principles that we need to encounter. However, when you're a researcher and you're in the field, there's also the aspect of the field work ethics, or the standard ethics that you need to take into account. We've had situations whereby the procedural ethics that we need to follow does not really align with what you're doing while you're on the field, when you're doing your field work. So you also have to learn how to navigate this. And this is something that has really been important for us to also really emphasize on the importance of making sure that there's consistent dialogue when it comes to ethics, so we can really also support refugee-led refugee researchers who are engaging in research to have an understanding of how to navigate this particular ethical dilemmas that they might encounter while in the field, as well as just setting the appropriate expectations from the word go on how to manage some of these expectations or some of the ethical dilemmas that come around. The second thing that we've also learned is on the power imbalances. And this also comes from the fact that the power imbalances still exist. We've learned that this is something that still exists. We've seen that refugee researchers' qualifications sometimes are not taken into account. They may be skilled, qualified to conduct research, but then when it comes to accessing some of this information or conducting interviews, their work is still pegged on their identity and not really on their qualification. So really from the word go, really as we engage with different stakeholders or as we engage with different partners who would want to conduct research with, being intentional and really having this conversation around the power symmetry, which is really important. The conversation around the privilege as well, recognizing that the privilege that might be accorded to a researcher who's not a refugee is different within the refugee space. So these are some of the things that we've learned. And as we go into the next discussion, we'll be breaking down further based on our experiences and also other things that we've learned along the way. Thank you so much. Back to you, Alana.
Thank you so much for that presentation, Foni and Bisimwa. It was brilliant to hear a little bit more, to get a taste of some of the ongoing and research that you all have completed, but also then for you to touch on some of the topics we'll come to later. I can't help but notice just how aligned both the presentations from yourselves and then Jigsaw are on some of the really foundational things that need to happen and need to change to, as you said, Foni, to really walk the talk of refugee-led research, what that means, the training, the resources, addressing power imbalances, and really considering what do the ethics in a situational context look like, even if the procedure may be different or not aligned with that. So I'm really excited to dig into that a little bit more later. In terms of the presentations, I will finally turn to Fuad from the American University of Beirut to present on his work and the...
Well, thank you, Alana, and thanks a lot for inviting me to present also American University of Beirut in this very important event. And I would also express my gratitude to Katrina, Bisimwa, and Foni for actually very insightful presentation. I think they set it in a very wonderful way that put a sort of a challenge for me about, because I may get it from a different perspective. So my name is Fuad, M. Fuad, which is, I don't know, I'm missing the second Fuad. So, because it's a weird to have like a Fuad M. I'm Professor of Public Health at the American University of Beirut and chair of IDRC Forced Displacement Program in the Middle East. Myself is a displaced person from Syria, moved to Lebanon 12 years ago now, and working mainly on research on forced displacement. I would try to have again, as I said, sort of to set the scene for the conversation later. I would to have like a different angle to go through that. So may I have like the next slide? So, just to put here an example about the importance of the context. And Lebanon is a great example for having such a sort of how that affect our conversation when talking about research-led, refugee-led research. So Lebanon is a middle-income country, went through non-stop crises since decades, started with, civil war in 1975, that lasted for 15 years. Then several waves of refugees started 7 decades ago with Palestinian refugees in 1948, and then the Iraqi refugees in late 90s and 2000, then the Syrian refugees in 2011 till now. But it's not only the refugee crisis that affect the country. In the last 4 years, starting in October 2019, a severe economic depression hit the country, and considered now by World Bank as sort of the top 3 collapsed country since the early 20th century, which is quite strange. The 95% of the local currency devaluated in the last 3 years. As if like this is not the end, because the country faced also a huge explosion in 2020, considered the biggest explosion, non-atomic explosion since the Second World War, and also, the COVID, like many other countries. So this sort of, the issue of protracted long-term multi-crises is something that could be an example about, how that affect refugees and host communities at the same time. Next, please. So this is an example. Lebanon is in a small country, also because of political instability. There's no national census since 90 years now. And as mentioned, like a massive movement of Syrians, Palestinian, migrant workers to the country, and the economic crisis. I'm saying that because that led to the issue of many consequences that affect refugees, mainly refugees in the country, especially the Syrian refugee that, now almost like 1 million Syrian refugees in this small country live in non-camp setting, and 90% of them have no legal document, some of them, like 80%, are registered at the UNHCR, but there are, sizable number non-registered also, and talking also about very hate speech in the country, no permission for work permission, because Lebanon is not a signatory for the Convention of 51. I'm saying that, put this set of crises just to hopefully that in the discussion will bring the issue of challenge that, face the issue of doing research with refugees or led by refugees. And next slide, please. I will set here some sort of example about different programs and projects at the American University of Beirut that usually, as one of the main academic hub in the Middle East, AUB engaged a lot in this question about refugees, and many projects since decades actually were conducted and still active for refugees and with refugees. And this is some examples about the different programs. So one about, what it's called, it's a Center for Refugee Research and Policy Center at the San Francisco Institute for Public Policy and International Affairs. Some of the projects run by the center on refugees policy and governance in Palestinian refugee camps, informal adaptive mechanism among refugees in the Middle East, in fact, and figures on Syrian refugee crisis. Most of these projects are conducted with refugees themselves, and I will postpone later about the challenging of what that means to have a partner with refugees themselves. The current one is the IDRC chairs, of course, migration for displacement. The current one is to monitor geographies of tension and insecurity in Lebanon, assessing factors and mechanisms that influence mitigation of communal tension. This is something very big in the last year, the tension between the host communities and the refugees around two big issues, return and integration. And there's some specific topics on health or education and on social issues. That one totally run by refugees. Aime project, which is an intervention studies aimed to mitigate the drivers of early marriage among Syrian refugee adolescent girls in Lebanon. I like what Bissimo and Foni mentioned about the issue of the obstacles, and I would like to add here one of these issues that we face in Middle East, in Lebanon specific, and can be summarized by 3 issues. One is the decision making, because we use that a lot about engaging refugees and host communities in making the decision, and I think this is one of the main challenges, because in some fragile settings, there's a big question about how the decision is made. And it's not just about, decision makers, but who are those decision makers and how the decision is made, which lead to the second, challenge, which is the political determinants of such a, topic, conducting research with refugees and by refugees. I think this is another issue that usually we as academicians, we don't approach that from this perspective of political determinants. And the third issues, which is the legalities, or the legal situation of refugees, and to put it like even broader, even questioning what refuge definitions means in such a context, and what is the legal situation when it comes to sometimes decades of displacement. I'll stop here, and hopefully we can come back to these issues in our discussion that will come soon. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fuad, for that context setting, particularly in the country where you are working right now, where AUB is, and also starting to raise some of the challenges that you see in relation to some of the topics brought up earlier, but also I think thinking particularly on the legalities, political determinants, and decision-making just being really core to this conversation about refugee-led and participatory research. So now we will be moving into the panel discussion. So I'll stop sharing my screen so that hopefully it's a little bit easier to see everybody here. And to start things off, I'd like to first come back to the Refugee-Led Research Hub, and maybe Fani, if you're okay to kick us off. There's been a lot of really great points made around the distinctions, the definitions, the challenges, really at the core of refugee-led and participatory research, as well as some of the steps that need to be taken to move in that direction, whether it's the structure of the team, some of the training initiatives that have been emphasized. But I'd really like to kind of go around to the panelists and ask for what does that really mean, both refugee-led and participatory research? Are there key distinctions? And if we're thinking about the steps that need to get there, I think it's really helpful to start with the core of what do we really mean by that phrasing and that term. So Fani, I'll come to you first.
Thank you so much. I think it's really interesting. These two terms are very intriguing to me, because when we talk about refugee-led research, I've been able to do that. When we talk about participatory research, I've been a participant in a research that was termed participatory. I think before we even get to this particular section within the forced displacement, it's really important to really look at refugees as people who are at the center of the knowledge production, and they also bring quite a rich diversity and perspective. When I think about refugee-led research, and from my own experience, it's really about being able to lead from the start to the end, I know it's very challenging, but then at the same time, it's also about how do we support refugee researchers to lead the particular research they want to lead from the start to the end. For me, it's also about giving away the power from the traditional systems and giving away the power to the refugees to really decide this is what is important to us. While it can be very difficult to move away from the conventional way of research, of thinking when thinking about research, it's also more challenging to embrace new ways of doing research that might be more sensitive to the priorities of displaced persons at the end of it. There's, as much as we are thinking about refugee-led research, there's also a risk that if we stop asking ourselves why we're doing things, and then we won't advance the desired outcome. So for me, when I think about refugee-led research, it's really about allowing refugees within their own rights to decide, this is really a priority for us. This is something that we want to do. This is an issue for us. And I think for me, leading the access to work permit study, that was really important because I was able to see that we talk about livelihood, but do we talk about the gap that exists between policy and practice? That for us was important, that we interrogate this so that we have the desired outcome. When I think about participatory research on the flip side, I believe that for me, the two components that comes to my mind. Number one is it's really about building the trust among the researcher and the participant. And why I say this is really important, because when you think about participatory research, most of the time, participatory is not actually participatory. The research is designed, questions are already designed, and then at some section will include, yes, we will work with refugees. But if we're really thinking about the trust building process, then it's also about flipping our minds and thinking about refugees as also partners within this particular research process that we're undertaking. Partners for them to be able to really contribute to the process, for them to also own the process. Because at the end of the day, we gather all these findings, then we come back to the community, and the community does not accept it because they were not seen as partners. They were more merely seen as, well, you're a participant. So it's really about building the trust so that the community can also see themselves within this particular process. The second thing that I feel when I think about participatory research and how I will define it, I define it from the trust angle. The second part I define it is from really involving the partners, the research partners at all stages, from the stage of the to really discussing to the final stage of the presentation or the dissemination. It's really about having them know what is happening and including them within that particular process. If we're really looking at a question, then we need to ask, is this the actual question? Is this a question that the community feels is important? The way we ask the question is also important, and participatory becomes participatory when we're open enough to allow the research partners to ask us, but how did you come to this particular question? Who told you this question is something that is important? Why are we focusing on this? And I think when we interrogate those different sections, then that is when research becomes participatory.
Thanks so much for that, Fani. There's so much good content in your response, and so detailed too, thinking about some of the examples of your own research that you mentioned, and really breaking down that distinction between building trust and involving partners at all stages and why that's so important from a participatory lens, and then also the idea of where does the power exist in current systems and how to kind of shift that. Katrina, those are some of the points that you were making in your presentation about refugee-led research. And Aime, Parfait, and Aime, I'd love to come to you as research assistants with Jigsaw to understand your thoughts on the distinction and how you would define and think about both refugee-led and participatory research. And I think, Aime, is it okay if I come to you first?
Yes, it's okay. Thank you. To answer the question, as a research participant, as a research assistant at Jigsaw, I would like to talk about such a difference by saying that the refugee-led research is the one where refugees themselves own the study, and they take decision of all the processes. However, when it comes to participatory research, refugees themselves participate at different extents, but they are not at a level of deciding, of taking decision about, for instance, how the data will be collected, the tools that will be used. They can be involved, but they cannot decide. For instance, as a youth researcher during the Voices of Refugee study, I was in charge of collecting data, but I was not the one who decided about, for instance, the research topic. So you can see that refugees participate in the process, but they don't decide on how to do the study. Yeah, thank you. Maybe Aime Parfait can add on what I said. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. So on this question, I feel like Fanny and Aime have said it all in terms of the meaning of refugee-led research and participatory. But I would like to share my own experience with the Voice of Refugee Youth as a youth researcher, and I was involved in different extents, and I was involved I got the training festival to be able to collect the data, and also I've been presented with some with the questions before the data collection so that I can provide some feedback. And also after data collection, I was given the chance to reproduce some to participate in the analysis and also to participate in the writing of some of the reports of the deliverables. Yes, I feel like this is a good way for the participatory research, a way of just helping also, yes, of course, the refugees to get some skills and also to continue the research career. Thank you very much.
Thank you both. It's really fantastic to hear a little bit more about your own experience as researchers, and particularly working on the Voices of Refugee Youth project. Fuad, I'd love to come to you. Finally, just going through each organization, and Basima, I'll be coming to you very soon with another question. But Fuad, on basically how we think about the terms of refugee-led and refugee participatory research, especially from the institutional context and thinking about really large projects, and the ways that research topics are determined, questions are asked, and what some of those terms mean to you.
Well, thank you again. I think this is really an important issue to discuss, and I like the way that Bonnie mentioned about the power imbalance. One of the main issues to distinguish between participatory, action research, that the way that we use it, in a different research method, and research led, is exactly this issue of power imbalance, because there is always power hierarchy regardless of the way that we use. We're talking about, funders, academicians, and the issue of refugees. We're talking about, access to refugees through the gatekeepers, the host communities. And the least power, actually, in this case, are the refugees themselves. I think when talking about this participatory issue, and I will bring some example also from the context, that means there is a sort of negotiation between different powers. Whereas with the refugees themselves, or the refugees research itself, I mean, the issue here that those group of population have no power, because actually they have no strong legal status, and that creates a lot of tension in not just between the refugee and host communities, but also in terms of how to impose, in many cases, how we impose the questions, the research question on people. I will give an example as a topic that done years ago on Syrian refugees, adolescents in Lebanon, where that's mainly about body change and sexual harassment, and then we imposed that question on people. We collect data, we did in interviews, and at the end, even in the discussion, we didn't engage enough, the refugees. And when we had their voices, actually they simply said that, well, I think we need more schools and access to education than discussion on body change. And that was my first actually contact with that topic about, so why we have this power to have to impose this question, whereas the least engagement came from refugees themselves. So I think this power hierarchy is a major issue when we need to understand the topic. The second issue, I will keep the others later. The second issue, as I mentioned, is that still we have the issue of labeling. Refugees as sort of a different label, sort of a different group of population. That was, we create a parallel system for them, whether it's a humanitarian system or research system. So we have, as if like we are dealing with the different group of population. And that actually creates such a sort of a strange dynamic between, researchers themselves and the refugees. And definitely that will affect the result. Having labeling, group of people with any sort of label, like refugees or stateless or IDPs, make that, we do it, for the sake of research, but at the end, actually, they don't introduce themselves as a refugee, at the end. They should, be part of that interest. And that's create a lot of not just a problem, but also imbalance in the dynamic of doing so. So I think, to be short here, I think there's need to revise the entire research methodology when talking about people that are vulnerable, whether they are refugees or they are marginalized population, in a way that we need to have the question from a real bottom up and not vice versa. Stop here.
Thank you so much for that, Fuad. And I think it's really interesting to hear how a lot of the responses to the question of what does refugee-led research really mean kind of comes back to these power dynamics. Everyone's really kind of been getting at ownership and what is the relationship of refugees as researchers, refugees as participants to institutions and those who kind of hold power in research institutions. Something that I just want to point to in the chat, and I'm seeing a lot of activity there, which is absolutely wonderful from lots of people doing their own research, PhD candidates, master's students, and the like. Hala Ghanem has made a really excellent point about access to relationships with institutions and access to funding and the sort of that gatekeeping relationship. And I just want to call that out as a really important point in relation to some of the points that have come up in this discussion. And given this discussion, I think the topic of power dynamics is really important to dig into more. So Fani and Basimwa, in your presentation on some of the steps and actions that RLRH takes by the structure of the team setup, for example, to start to counteract perhaps some of those dynamics and create more of a symmetry or more of a balance. I'd love to hear a little bit more from you, Basimwa, about what steps are really key to address these power imbalances and maybe a little bit more about what RLRH is focused on doing to address those. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much, Alana. Yeah, so as RLRH, what we do is really to make sure that the refugee researchers and other forced displaced scholars can lead research, and the role of non-refugee researchers and colleagues is really support and guide in this process. And so we've really tried to set a system where the decision revolves around, a consultative kind of collective, process where we have non-refugee researchers and refugee researchers come together, discuss and agree on the process. We have had instances where non-refugee researchers approach us with their research ideas and projects. They would like to work with you on this project. And so our approach really is, yes, as much as you come with an idea, we would also like to, have that discussed within the team, share our own ideas, because there are issues that we need to consider. One of the issues is really, as a research, we need to think about the what, how, and why you are conducting the research. Because at the end of the day, really, we want this research to be impactful and relevant to improving and, effecting change into policy and programs. And so we have this consultative process that we engage in straight from the design of the research methodology, looking at the research questions, and then refining the whole proposal really. So this is one way that we do it, and this has been really very helpful for us, both for us and for non-refugee researchers, because at the end of the day, it's really about knowledge sharing and also trying to navigate through some of the ethical issues that may arise, and we've seen this work. So this is one of the best practice. Besides that, we also really consult beyond the team at RLRH and trying to making sure that the research that we are working on is relevant to the communities and the research participants that we intend to reach out to. I'll stop there and then maybe hand over to Foni if you have anything to add.
Sure. Maybe just two things to add. I think one of the system working on is really creating a structure that supports the researchers as well. More so like an opportunity for them to learn to learn the different skills as they're also doing the different work on research. So we have a traineeship program where we capture all the different, whether it's qualitative or quantitative, we capture all this information so that they can also reflect back on it as needed. And then I think the second thing that, just to add on what Bisimo was mentioning, it's also really important to have conversation with allies, people who are coming either to request for research to be done or to partner on research. So really having that intentional conversation around why is this important and how will we include refugees? What space do they have to engage with you? So really stemming from the point of having that conversation, identifying allies that can really, allies who support refugee-led research. And I think it's also prudent to say that sometimes different donor priorities might not take this into account, and you still need to be running and you need to be sustainable. So really also within this whole process, just to ensuring that we go back to the foundation of the hub, which is having refugee researchers at the center and then working with the people to really also understand the importance and how they can really support that refugee-led research agenda that we're trying to push forward.
Thanks so much for that, Foni and Bisima. I think the way that you've described the consultative and collective process that RLRH is really intentional about and goes through, and also the idea of building more and more structures through training, through identifying allies, and thinking about the language that donors who are funding research also bring to the table, and how to kind of account for this as another factor in those power dynamics is just really critical. Sort of from a similar vein, but thinking also about both the dynamics and then a little bit more about the positionality, both as community members, but as researchers. Aime and Aime Parfait, I'd really like to come to you to hear a little bit more about your perspective on the role that you've stepped into and how your research, and you're situated as both a community member, an advocate, a researcher, and how that really informs the work that you do. And Aime Parfait, I'd love to come to you first to hear some of your thoughts on this.
Yeah, thank you very much. In terms of the way as refugee researchers can be situated as community members, and I think we can just think about on researchers' identities, of course, helps influence the way we can collect data, but there are some positive side around that, because knowing the context enables to engage well with the participants, and also be flexible with the questions, and also be able to make them comfortable, and also being a part of the community, and motivates me as a researcher, and it gives me some energy for the research, because I feel like trying to advocate for the community, because of the findings will reach out to decision makers who can take the policies accordingly. Of course, there are some negative sides that I think ethics can just try to hold, because refugee researchers may assume that they may assume what they hear according to their own experience, or side with refugee participants more readily. Yes, because you come with your own experience as a refugee, and you have to try to mitigate this issue, because you have to get ideas from the participants, and I think that is where the ethics come at the play. And I like that from our Voice of Refugee Youth project, we have been prepared in this way, just to, even if we're going to conduct research in our communities, in our refugee communities, we have to think about avoiding the bias. Yes, that is more about what I can say. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for that. And then Aime, just to turn to you as well, your perspective on how research can situate you in multiple roles and your experiences in this capacity.
Yeah, so to answer the question, I would like to say that it can situate me as an advocate because I might do the research in the community where I came from, or which face the similar situation like the one I faced, and that can push me to advocate for it. Yeah, because I felt like looking back at my experience as a youth researcher through the voices of refugee, when correcting data, I was like, yeah, I'm giving back for the community. I'm exploring issues my community is facing, because I collected data in the camp where I came from. You see, so that gave me energy, and I was like, yeah, I will advocate for it, and refugee education will be improved, because I'm working on it as a researcher. And yeah, that made me like an advocate, because later, after the conduction of of data. We worked on different deliverables and we published some of them. So I was like, yeah, I'm an advocate, and I think this can be applied to other refugee researchers. So as they are exploring issues the refugee community are facing. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and I would like to add on the negative side of it, because collecting data in the same community I came from, some participants knew me, and I knew them. So they were like, how are you asking us the question? Like, you might have the answers. And yeah, that can be a hindrance for me to collect relevant data or enough data. Because I might consider myself, I'm researching issues that I know. So at some point I might feel like that, but that has been a hindrance, but I try to use the research ethics and take consideration of my research load than the community member, which helped me to collect enough data and relevant one. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Amy and Aime Parfait for your responses. And I know also that when we've spoken previously, you also mentioned about the really deep contextual knowledge that you've been able to bring to the table. As a researcher, your understanding of different partnerships and stakeholders when you're conducting your research. I don't know if there's anything that you want to add about that, but I think that's also a really fantastic perspective that we've discussed previously.
Can I intervene here? Just, I know that it's good to have, but I think that it's maybe also good to have more conversation than, because what's in mind is, and maybe the colleagues here could answer from their own experience, is the big question that always tick my mind, who represent refugees, in your settings, to be able to, to work with them or to bring them. So we deal with refugees as one homogeneous, group, and we think that, well, this is the refugee, community. But is it true? And do we have like a sort of one representation or people that could represent refugees to be able to talk about, the issue of refugee engagement, and aside from individuals, talking about, a sort of a group. That's always an issue that, at least in my experience, that always come to the conversation and the discussion.
I think that's a really great point, Fuad, and I would then ask you if there's specific either perspectives or voices or ways of positioning research that you think are either missing or maybe need to be better considered when it comes to those perspectives and representation, and how to think both about the field of forced displacement and migration studies, but then also thinking about specific context and what does representation look like. And I'd love to hear a little bit more about that from you.
Yes. Thinking about also, thinking loudly, but also from experience, in any group of, in society, you could have like a sort of people that represent this community or society, Unfortunately, when it comes to refugees, we deal with that as if like, this is a mass, there's a sort of a mass of people here, and we introduce ourselves in a way or another as if we are, their voices, and even when we try to find their voices, I don't think that we do it in a way that we can hear them properly. We could have our own experience in contacting people and trying to, talk to, part of, on their, own, voices. But in general, we always deal with that as if like they have just like a mask. They have no features. There's something that and that could create or could lead to what I mentioned at the beginning, the issue of political determinants. So, representing this group could create some sort of a political issues in the host countries, and that's an issue in everywhere. I mean, my experience without having representation for this group of people, we will keep doing that as sort of a sort of having very soft engagement, and it's not a deep, real engagement. And this is the same when talking about refugee-led research. I mean, who would decide that this is also their problem? That's a quick reflection on that. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. And I do see a couple of hands from other panelists up, so I'm going to, I think, come to you all. So Katrina, I saw your hand up, and then Bisimwa, do feel free to jump in afterwards.
Thanks, Alana. Yeah, just to pick up on what Fawad was saying about generalization, I think it's a really important point, and one that I think I referred to in the first presentation about the sort of the real reluctance that we have to generalize to any to make any generalizations in refugee communities, given that the dynamics, as Fawad mentioned in his presentation, the very specific dynamics in Lebanon cannot really be, you cannot sort of pick those up and plot them in another refugee context and expect the results to be the same or expect the learnings to be the same. So that's something that we've been very conscious of, particularly during Voices of Refugee Youth. And I think that's caused me to reflect that actually probably what we're talking about here is not so much refugee-led research, but community-led research, and that this just happens to be the community that we're dealing with. So what Aime Parfait and Aime very powerfully said about their positionality in their communities, that actually has less to do with the fact that they're refugees and the fact that they have things in common with the community that we were researching. So if there were a different community that was, a non-refugee community that had some kind of different experience, the sort of the power of their participation in that is not the fact that they're a refugee, it's because they're closer on that continuum of being contextually aware of that environment than I am, for example. Therefore, that therein lies the power. So I think saying something is either refugee-led or not, I think it's almost a distraction in terms of it's sort of detracting from the main point of we're looking for research that truly represents groups that self-identify as being part of the same thing, if that makes sense. Just a little reflection from me. Bisimwa, do you want to pick up from there?
Yes. Thanks for that. And I also wanted to pick on what Fawad just mentioned, and looking at how refugees are looked at as a homogeneous group, and usually decisions are taken by a minority of, I would say, a small number of people who oftentimes do not represent the views of the majority of refugees. There have been challenges really when it comes to representation, and these some of these challenges relate to resources, but I think there will be need for putting more resources to ensure that we have representation from different groups and refugee communities. Then when it comes to representation mainly in research, I think there are really groups of, I would say, affected populations generally, whose voices are audible in research in this field of refugees and forced migration. But there are also groups of, obviously, refugees and other displaced persons who kind of fall under the radar and whose voices are not really heard. I'll just maybe mention from my experience really conducting research in this field and working with my communities. There are a few groups that I'll mention. First is there are minority groups like the elderly, the persons with disability, or we also have the LGBTI community. These particular minority groups are rarely represented or researched about. And this is often because of resource constraints and because of oftentimes, policies in this field, and as it has already been mentioned, and decisions are made or really come as a result of research conducted on a specific group, which is mainly the larger group. And so the assumption is that the benefits will definitely go to all the different categories and groups of refugees and forced displaced persons. So the other category is the IDPs, especially smaller groups of internally displaced persons. These are people who are displaced within the same country from maybe one village to another, one region to another. They are not necessarily refugees, but they are displaced persons. And I think there's less attention that has been paid to really include them into research. And the thinking is oftentimes that they have less challenges than their community members who cross the borders. We also have, I would say, the host community, members of the host community. If we are to really, protect refugees, and if we are really to provide services to refugees, we need to also, include host communities. Most of the past research in this field and has been really in this field that include host community members has been widely looking at topics and aspects of research and refugee protection are rarely considered. I think we need to also think about including the host communities when we are conducting research. And I think moving forward, we need to start thinking about how can we have all these groups included in research. This will require a lot of partnership with local actors, including local organizations. We'll also have to partner with the local government structures in place. I think then our research will be more inclusive and will have more value from the research that we conduct. Yeah, so that's also the addition that I wanted to make on that point. Over.
Thank you so much for that addition, and just to the conversation about representation and maybe which voices are not always represented or should be further considered. And Amy, I see that your hand is up, and so I'd love to come to you. And then Aime Parfait, I'd also like to pose the question around what voices we may need more of in this space. And after that, I'll probably come to everyone for their final thoughts, just to be conscious of the last few minutes. I know this is a really rich discussion. I wish we had more time, but Amy, to you, and then Aime Parfait, and then to the final points. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Alana. I could not turn on my video. The electricity is cut off unexpectedly. Sorry for that. And I would like to add on the challenges, on the voices that are missing in the research. I could talk about the female refugees. According to my experience during the voices of refugee during data collection, I used to face these challenges of not finding the girls after school. After school, they could tell me that they are going to do the core or some domestic activities than boys. So I was like, yeah, females are responsible for domestic activities than boys. And I was like, yeah, oh, there might be some intervention or initiative for girls to be involved so that we can get their voices. Yeah, and that was the experience in Rwanda. And according to data collected from Pakistan, there are some cultural limitation to girls to participate in research, in data collection, and being interviewed. And I feel like, yeah, there is a gap for females to be involved, and this is not fair. They might be involved, and of course, there might be some initiative to address this gap. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Aime. And Aime Parfait, can I ask the same question to you?
Yes, sure. So in the light of what Aime has said, I think refugees themselves in general are still, their voices are still missing in terms of the research and forced migration and forced displacement, because for instance, on my side, I became interested in research when I was still in my third year of university, but it was after like 2 years that I was being able to be involved with Jigsaw. So I think there are those differences, there are those issues of being integrated into the research for unforced displacement. And I think the children and youth are missing voices too, especially within the refugee education research. And it is extremely important to include the perspectives, of course, and voices. And we have learned a lot of lessons during the voices of research, the voices of refugee youth, about the methods of including children in research. And one of the observations was that youth researchers the observation from the youth researchers was that we perhaps did not use the most age-appropriate data collection tools, because there were some questions that we asked which were too complicated for secondary school students, which is now why we are exploring more participatory and child-friendly research tools for the global education for refugee, the global education for refugee, the GEAR that Katrina has presented, so that we can just be able to do better at including those perspectives of children.
Thanks so much, Aime Parfait. And so in the last couple of minutes here, I'd like to give everyone a chance to just give a couple of closing thoughts. If there's anything that you would like to say to some of the new, young, well-seasoned researchers who are on the call today, but also any other thoughts that you may have on the discussion. And Funny, I'll come to you first, and I'll kind of just go around the group quickly.
Definitely, I'll try and keep it brief. I think one of the things that for upcoming researchers that we need to do is really just read and use the tools that are available to us, resources that have already been provided to us by different institutions. I think plugging into that is one thing. The second thing I'd say to more seasoned researchers is really we need to recognize the privilege that we have, and once we recognize that privilege, we'll be able to really work with the junior researchers or upcoming researchers. Unless we get to the point of actually acknowledging that I have so much privilege as a researcher, I'm able to if we don't realize that, then we'll still have these conversations going on for years, whereby we have people who are displaced, but that's not their first expertise. Their expertise is their researchers, then they're displaced. So we need to get to that point of actually acknowledging that they're facing displacement, which gives them a very unequal ground to play. But if we recognize that we have more sort of like a playground and bring them on board, then we will make a difference. We will have a different conversation around research that is produced for the community, looking at policy, the practice, and the gap, and how we can really work together. So I think for me, those are some of the things that are important to take into account.
Thanks so much, Funny. Bisimwa, can I come to you?
Yes, just to add on that, yeah, I think, as Fonny mentioned, I think we need first to recognize that privilege that we have. And beyond that, I think we also have to really work hard, to, come into spaces where our voices can be heard, our ideas can be shared, and see how we can then support the junior researchers, to develop, to gain knowledge, and also kind of bringing them into those spaces. Again, I always emphasize on a partnership, and this is very important because the field of research, and especially research in forced displacement, and looking at what we are really trying to push, having persons with that history or background of displacement, taking lead and kind of participating. This will not be possible if we do not really kind of work with organizations, partners, and other stakeholders who share the same vision, the same mission with us. So it's more of a concerted effort, and if we do this, we'll be able to really see a lot of change, not only in how research is conducted, but also on the impact. We'll start seeing impact of our research, research that comes, that is relevant to the context, that is, making an impact on the policy and on how projects and programs are being implemented in the refugee response. Yeah, so these are the few words that I really wanted to emphasize on. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Fuad, can I come to you for your final thoughts?
Thank you. So I cannot agree more with what Fonny and Bissimo. It's difficult to add, to be honest, because I think this is really very important to look into, refugee researcher as researcher first, and and refugee second. But I can add here, which is, thinking as also from the academic perspective, I think this interesting, important event tells us that there's a huge need to do research, on the power dynamic of refugee research, and what are the rules of different actors in this process, donors, the civil society, the academic institution, the community itself. So I think there's a need to understand that, to do research on that in a way, in a purpose for empowering, refugee-led research. Once we know that, I think we could have the tool to empower that sort of approach. And and thank you very much for this great opportunity to raise these issues.
And thank you so much. Aime, can I come to you for any final thoughts?
Yes, sure. I would like to emphasize on the point of empowering refugees just to increase their participation in research. Looking at how Jigsaw involved us as youth researchers in the Voices of Refugee Study. Yeah, they empowered us with required research skills to be involved. And that helped us to be involved, to be fully skilled and have a great participation, which led to data collection. So I would like to say that refugees need to be empowered at different extent, of course. That was a participatory research, and Jigsaw trained us in research methodologies, how to conduct research, and that lead us to be researchers. So I would encourage other research organizations to not leave refugees behind, just to empower them with the training skills they need so that they can be involved, and that will lead to relevant research, or we'll have more findings on different research topics. Yeah, thank you. Okay.
Thanks so much, Amy. Katrina, and then Aime Parfait. After that, I'll give you the last word.
Thanks, Alana. Yeah, just to build on what Amy was saying and a few others as well, I've got two main big messages. The first one is training. I think that we need to do, really invest seriously in refugee education and refugee training and research skills, so that refugees can enter research with confidence and the skills that they need in order to shift the dial and to then be the ones who are in control of the agenda. The second big point I have is employment pathways. So I would love for other research organisations like Jigsaw to follow us and to join us in this journey, in which we have employed now research assistants such as Parfait and Aime off the back of the participation that they did during that study, thereby creating them a viable employment pathway through which they can access multiple international institutions through the work that we do. They then have that access. They actually have a roadmap through which they can become fully fledged researchers. So I would strongly encourage other organisations in a position such as us to look at ways of doing similar things. Thank you. I'll pass over to Aime Parfait.
Yeah, thank you very much. Maybe I also support the idea of collaboration, because without getting the skills from Jigsaw, without the trainings, I would not have been part of the research career. So I support this idea of collaboration and also of involving refugees. Yes, and also maybe for the researcher, I can just maybe advise him to always ask some questions before starting the research process. Some had questions about why am I going to do that, and who are the beneficiaries, and who stand to lose out. So I think those questions are also very important in order to be able to mitigate some risks, and also to know the partners that you can just be with. Thank you very much.
A really great foundational point to end on, and thank you all for your closing thoughts there, and also just for your fantastic participation in this discussion. And I will, with that, hand it back to Camila to close us out. And thanks to the panelists all once more so much for your participation.
Thanks, everyone. This was a fantastic discussion and a great way to end the Migration Summit. Well, with the panels, we have the closing ceremony on Tuesday. So, this so links to what we heard in the previous sessions, and so much about the power imbalance has come up in all the sessions on refugee research. So this is definitely something we need to tease out and sort of to think about more. But I think most importantly, and what you said, Foni, what we need to remember is refugee is just a label. It's not their it's not an identity. So, and this transcends not just research, but employment and education. It's just a label, and we need to look beyond this label. It's only a political label, this political label, and see refugees for the researcher, for the coder, for the doctor, and for the teacher that they are. And displacement is just a circumstance. So on that, I thank you all. This has been a fantastic session. Thank you, UNHCR and Alana, and thank you, Katrina, for putting this amazing session together. Thank you for all the panelists. And I really wish you a great day and a great weekend. And we hope to see you on the 2nd of May for the closing ceremony. And we're encouraging everyone's voices to be heard. So please come join us on the 2nd of May for the closing ceremony. And thank you very much. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lorraine. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.